To study music professionally in Japan today usually means something much the same as what it means in Western countries. One learns to perform or compose on Western instruments, in Western tonal systems, for the Western concert tradition. Traditional Japanese music, played on instruments of Chinese or Japanese origin, and in tonal systems unrelated to those learned from Western music, remains alive and studied, but far less often even in its country of origin. That has been, in some form or other, the state of affairs in Japan for over 150 years now, as two traumatic cultural events within the space of a single century brought waves of Western culture flooding into Japan, along with a widespread belief that embracing certain elements of Western culture was the way to stay competitive on the global stage. The first such traumatic event was the arrival of the so-called Black Ships in 1853, which forced an end to Japan's 250-year period of voluntary isolation, in response to which Japan quickly became a colonial empire of its own. The second such traumatic event was the end of World War II, which ended Japan's period of empire and established an American military presence in Japan that remains there to this day. But despite all of these events and the comparatively slight presence of traditional music in conservatories, traditional songs and music inspired by the tonal systems of traditional songs continue to be sung in homes, at festivals, and on various television programs. Even if it is not often studied formally, it remains part of the soundscape that one at least overhears by growing up in Japan. And thus one would expect that, of all the many types of music capable of influencing a video game soundtrack composer in modern Japan, traditional music and its very non-Western scale structures would be one such influence among many. The purpose of this paper is not at all to suggest that such traditional influences are the largest or the most important in game soundtracks. Indeed, most pieces for video games do not display any such influence, at least overtly. But such influence is undeniably present in some tracks, and being conversant enough in traditional Japanese tonalities to recognize these scale types when they do appear can be a valuable tool. It is one way among many to see what may be going on in some of these pieces. Before delving into my case studies, a brief overview of Japanese tonality will be necessary. First, Japanese music can be most broadly broken down into gagaku, the imperial court's music and that associated with Shinto rituals, and zokugaku, the common people's folk music from various regions across the nation. Before the Meiji Restoration of 1868, music theory in Japan was almost entirely based on gagaku, using a theoretical system imported from China. For today's talk, however, I will be focusing entirely on the scale types used in zokugaku, because these are the ones more embedded in the Japanese soundscape, and that find their ways into game soundtracks. The music theoretical tools at our disposal for analyzing this music is, therefore, all under 2 centuries old. The most celebrated and widely used theoretical system for the analysis of zokugaku is that presented by Koizumi Fumio in the 1950s, which conceives of Japanese folk music as operating within the basic frame of a perfect fourth, with one movable note inside this tetrachordal frame. By keeping the frame of the fourth constant, the note on the inside can move to one of 4 positions, producing 4 possible tetrachords. He names them the miyakobushi, with a semitone and then a major third, the ritsu, with a whole tone and a minor third, the minyo, with a minor third and then a whole tone, and the ryukyu, with a major third and a semitone. When you stack 2 of the same tetrachord on top of each other, with a whole tone between the 2 tetrachords, you get the following 4 octave framed scales. Note that the ritsu and minyo scales are both rotations of the pentatonic scale without half steps, which is the type best known in the West. The miyakobushi and the ryukyu scales are pentatonic in that they have 5 notes, but they place their 5 notes in patterns not often seen outside Japan, involving mostly major thirds and half steps, and it is on these latter 2 scale types that all of my examples today will be based. The arrival of Western tonality in the mid to late 19th century caused Japanese composers to have to contend with the question of how to harmonize their folk scales in the Western tonal system. The myakobushi tends to become a type of Phrygian tonality, or a minor key whose tonic was at the top of the bottom tetrachord, and which lacked scale degrees 4 and 7 from a Western orientation. While the ryukyu is the only type harmonized as a major key, with the melodies containing the distinctive major third leaps that you see here, just as in the myakobushi. In demonstrating places in which these scale types are helpful analytical tools, I should be clear in saying that I am not asserting that all of these cases are ones in which the music is unequivocally in these scales, only that some amount of influence from them might have gone into their composition, and that being aware of them can help us to tease out potential extra layers of meaning in some of these pieces. I will, however, begin with a few cases in which there is absolutely no question that these traditional scales are being evoked, and for clear reasons. Mother 3, the long-awaited sequel to the NES classic Earthbound, with music composed by Sakai Shōgo, features 2 tracks whose uses of traditional scales are incontestable because of the clear extra-musical references that these scales are making. One is the music that accompanies your time on Tane Tane Island, a small tropical island to the south of the land on which most of the game takes place. This tropical island setting makes it no surprise that much of the music that plays during your time here is in the ryukyu scale, specifically this melody. The fact that the melody both ascends and descends, plays every note in the scale but never any note outside the scale, and at 2 different levels of transposition to boot, makes its scalar intentionality quite clear. At the same time, the bass part's use of the very much out-of-scale Mixolydian-flavored flat 7 stops the track from sounding 100% ryukyu, even while this melody is occurring. In fact, you can't quite see it here, but the bass part maps out an entire 12-bar blues progression, over some of which the above excerpt appears. Perhaps it is a nod to the main character's origins from outside the island, and the way they are taking in the island's atmosphere through their own foreign lenses. In fact, the characters originate from a place intended to be a parody of the USA, where the blues, after all, originated. The other track from Mother 3 that uses traditional scalar material is similarly explicit about it, and this time it is the music that plays when your characters are being chauffeured to the big evil city in a luxurious limousine. The music that plays consists of alternations between the leitmotif for the game's villains and new material that is entirely within the myakobushi scale, and again, quite flagrantly so. What accents this material's myakobushi-ness even more is that the villain's leitmotif is quite explicitly not myakobushi. The contrast between the 2 sources of material thus stands out quite strongly in this track, at least if you know what scale patterns to listen for. So, why would Sakai write this track with such a heterogeneous combination of ingredients? Unlike the music for Tane Tane Island, there does not seem to be an environmental factor around that would call forth the use of a traditional scale here, though the topical reference is quite clear. The myakobushi segments of the music, as well as the rhythmic backing track, are based on the enka genre of music, which frequently uses myakobushi melodies and figures like the ones that Sakai uses in Mother 3. Here is an example of actual enka, or rather, parody enka with the conventions exaggerated. aside from that 671 closing tag at the end, all of the melodic material is entirely myakobushi, as you can see and maybe hear. Now here's Mother 3 in the Limousine again, just for comparison. The exact reason why Sakai chose to create an enka version of this theme at precisely this point in the game is not particularly clear, though it does track with the game's persistent sense of whimsical humor and could perhaps allude to the image of the Limousine's driver listening to enka during the trip. The mapping of the myakobushi to a Phrygian-like variety of the Western minor mode has caused it to accrue all sorts of dark associations that it did not have in Japan before the arrival of Western tonality. These associations can be glimpsed vividly in the first Pokemon game, in which the myakobushi is used for the haunted Pokemon Tower. Many thanks to Mark Bennis, by the way, for his beautiful transcription of the entire score to Pokemon Red and Blue, which I'll be using for this upcoming analysis. First, we have what could be called an introductory phrase, which sounds like this. In that melody, there is only one out-of-scale note, which is this 16th note D sharp at the end of measure 2. Now here on beat 2 of measure 6 is where what strikes me as the real tune begins, the melody that sounds more like a vocal melody. And for 12 whole measures, it is absolutely, uncompromisingly myakobushi. After this moment, it breaks out of the myakobushi scale. But what is notable about this moment is that in breaking out of the myakobushi, it does not move to the Western diatonic. Rather, it leaps straight into much fuller chromaticism and then goes completely into whole tone scales by measure 21. It finally comes to a rest on a long C in measure 24, as we just heard. And that C is in the current whole tone scale, but also, conveniently, part of the original myakobushi E minor that the piece began in. And this happy coincidence allows the wavetable to reorient us into that tonal area with that half step between F sharp and G, paving the way for this final, slow, high, ghostly melody back in the same myakobushi tonality as before, which leads directly into the repeat. Now, turning quickly to the second generation of Pokemon, the Gold and Silver games have 3 towers that all have myakobushi-based pieces that are quite similar to each other, but quite different from the piece we just heard. I'm going to look at only one such piece, that being the one for Sprout Tower. Now, as you see, my little scalar diagram at the top of the slide has changed a little bit, in that the note I'm marking as tonic is actually the Phrygian final. At least according to my hearing of this piece, it's a little truer than was the previous one to the traditional Japanese use of the myakobushi, in which F would be the much more normal final note, rather than the Western minor tonic, which here would be B flat. The only truly non-myakobushi moment is this spot where D flat and E flat follow each other in close succession, which wouldn't happen in Japanese folk music. That aside, the melody cleaves quite faithfully to myakobushi norms. Take a listen now and see what you think about the notion of tonic. As you can hear, F and C get a lot of attention, while B flat is really given only passing treatment. The result is thus very unlike the Pokemon Tower theme from Red and Blue, even while the traditional Japanese scalar basis has remained the same. From these rather flagrant examples, we can now proceed to a few that are much more conjectural on my part, although what I hope to demonstrate here is that even when we are not completely sure that a traditional scale is being used intentionally, we can still use our knowledge of them to help understand the effects produced by a particular piece of music. Yume Nikki, a free RPG Maker game from 2004 that has become unexpectedly popular worldwide, is about wandering through surreal dreamscapes whose visuals and patterns of connection to each other are bewildering and hard to make sense of. Their signification intentionally underdetermined, and the logic just about impossible to puzzle out. The game has a distinctive soundtrack in that nearly every track consists of a small loop that is only a few seconds long. Some are little more than a single sound effect. Some feature just a few notes in alternation. And some consist of nothing more than a single held chord. A few do feature more traditionally melodic bits of melody, and one such track occurs in one of the game's most famous areas. This is a zoomed out map of some of an area often known to fans as the Pink Sea, which you might be able to tell consists of a few islands and a wide expanse of ocean. The most notable and most famous place in the Pink Sea is this conical house, and if you enter it, you meet this little blonde girl, whose bedroom seems to be something of a parallel universe version of your own. She's even the same height as you and has the same red shoes. Now, most pertinent to us today, this is the music that plays when you're in her house. It uses only notes from the Ryukyu scale. Now, of course, the loop is so small that this could just be the result of total chance. It's also worth comparing it to the other music that plays adjacent to it. A set of wobbly bell sounds plays when you're walking or biking around in the Pink Sea. While when you're in the house, you have the option of turning off the light, which causes the music to change to this hemiolic loop. So if we line all three of those up, we see that being outside gives us wide leaps with a wobbly detuning effect destabilizing it. Being inside with the lights on narrows things to the Ryukyu scale within the range of a minor sixth, and turning the lights off narrows things even to a minor third and suggests full diatonicism. In this context, the Ryukyu scale loop is the comfortable middle ground. You're not lost at sea, but you're not in the dark either. Perhaps it's the way things should be when you're out relaxing on an island with a friend, as opposed to having to bike through the water or having your friend turn into a nightmarish monster just because you turned out the lights. My final example is one that really is not in any Japanese scale, and yet I will argue that being aware of these Japanese folk scales still enriches our understanding of the layers of the piece. The piece in question is the famous Lost Woods theme from Ocarina of Time, which I will now play in full. Because of its opening motif that outlines the FB tritone over an F major chord, the piece is often raised as an example of the Lydian mode. For example, these quotes from the Song Appeal podcast and the Zelda Wiki both call it Lydian. Both of these sources, however, also mention that one could analyze the piece's tonic as C rather than as F. After all, aside from the opening on the F chord, there is very little sense throughout the rest of the piece that F is tonic. One could suggest A minor as a tonic because of the way the piece ends on a functional dominant of A minor, but C major is the more convincing option for the rest of it. Thanks especially to these 2-5-1-6 chordal loops in the middle of the piece. However, to someone with some familiarity with Japanese folk songs, it is likely that this tritone outlining opening will call to mind another song, Usagi Usagi, or Rabbit Rabbit. Now, Usagi Usagi is rather uncompromisingly Myakobushi, despite its somewhat unusual beginning on the note above the final. Let's listen to it now. Usagi, Usagi, nani mite haneru, jugo ya otsukisama mite haneru. So, starting from a position of maximum instability by outlining the tritone between B and F, it settles somewhat more onto A for the third phrase, and then eventually makes its way down to the final E near the end. The Lost Woods theme, from a zoomed out perspective, matches this exactly. It starts on F by outlining the F to B tritone and ends on E. Now, of course, the details are very different, as you may remember from this analysis, but I think it's also worth focusing on the phrase-by-phrase level and observing something about the melody. So that's the first phrase displayed without its harmony. Like Usagi Usagi, it follows the F to B tritone with a melody that arcs up and then comes down to rest on E. Unlike Usagi Usagi, it isn't Myakobushi. It uses G heavily. But what this heavy use of G does is allow the melody to outline the E minor triad. And in fact, it does this both here in the first phrase and in the second phrase. In doing so, a type of E tonicity can be suggested that is actually unavailable in the strict Myakobushi and is based on the Western idea of the triad, although it ends up tying back into the tonal center of Usagi Usagi in a different way. Now, when we add the bass back in, the C in the bass suggests something else, namely 4-to-1 plagal motion in C major, which turns this E minor arpeggiation into part of a tonic functioning C major 7 chord. Still though, I do think it notable that even once we work our way into the section with the 2-5-1-6 loop in C major, every single phrase still melodically ends on E, and 2 of them feature the melodic leap from B to E. And finally, the piece ends with a half cadence to the dominant of A minor, which under certain lights we can also see as the Phrygian final. With everything totaled up, I argue that we have a case of melody-harmony split in this piece, with the harmony emphasizing C major, while the melody emphasizes a Phrygian E that is not Myakobushi but seems to be informed by it. So I hope that all of these cases have illustrated a spectrum of situations in which knowing about these traditional Japanese modes can help us to see what might be going on in this music, whether or not the music clearly sticks to the scale or not. Thank you.